You're listening to The Art of Procurement, episode 117.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, and thanks for tuning in today to another episode of The Art of Procurement, and what is our first interview show of 2017. And my guest today is Mark Trowbridge. So Mark is a co-founder and the principal consultant of Strategic Procurement Solutions. And Strategic Procurement Solutions is a provider of supply management improvement, skills testing, employee training, staff augmentation, and cost reduction services. And prior to SPS, Mark was the Director of Sourcing and Contract Management for Bank of America. Mark's a published author. He's written a number of featured articles for publications like Inside Supply Management, Supply Chain Management Review, and Eastside Supply Management. And he's also a regular presenter at procurement and supply chain conferences really around the world. It was in fact at a recent ISM Indirect conference, which I had in December, that Mark and I actually met. And we were introduced by Pierre Mitchell of Spend Matters, who was my guest on the last show of 2016. Mark and I chatted for some time, and as I got to know him, I knew that I needed to invite him onto the show, and unfortunately he accepted my invite, really without reservation. The main topic for today's conversation is the notion of procurement superheroes. So what are their characteristics? How can procurement leaders best deploy and also retain them? During the conversation, Mark shared 6 different attributes of a procurement superhero, and I would really encourage any procurement professional to listen so that maybe you can self-assess where you stand, see if there's any gaps that you have that perhaps you should work on in 2017. But we did talk about a lot more than just this topic in the interview, and I think it clocked in at something like 55 minutes when it was done. I talked a little bit before about a desire to not stick as rigidly to my interview outlines that I prepare this year in 2017. And actually, I was chatting to a CPO listener earlier in the week, and he made a comment that, sometimes he'd love for me to go a bit deeper on some of the topics. And, it got me thinking that really, he's exactly right. Sometimes time constraints mean that I've been more focused on covering the material that I want to ask, rather than perhaps going off course a little bit and digging deeper into just some of the interesting topics or maybe individual points that are made during the course of a conversation. So my resolution in 2017 is to start doing just that. It might mean some less polished questions, perhaps a few more ums and ahs, so please do bear with me. However, I do think that it will help bring out even more perspectives and, importantly, actions that we can take in our daily lives to implement some of the great ideas that we hear on the show. Okay, well, with all that being said, what I'm going to do is I'll roll the tape on my conversation with Mark. I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement interview. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I'm joined today by Mark Trowbridge. Mark is the co-founder and principal at Strategic Procurement Solutions. So, Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you.
I'm delighted that you were able to join me today. So, I wanted to jump right into it. First of all, what are you passionate about right now in terms of some of the challenges or perhaps even some of the opportunities that face the procurement community?
Okay, good question. It's actually sort of interesting, having been in the procurement field long enough to have a head pretty much covered with gray hairs now. It's interesting to see how things have cycled back around to more full value procurement. Mm-hmm. This is something that we were pushing hard to achieve in the 1990s, and then the whole theme of strategic sourcing swept in to many organizations, which was a great value add and added a discipline to the cost reduction side of supply chain management. But too many things that have unfortunately taken place in many organizations have come out of that strategic sourcing mindset. So one of the challenges that I see and the opportunity that goes along with that is that a strategic sourcing mindset has really been taken too far in way too many groups. So that the procurement groups are pushing so hard to book cost savings that they're alienating their internal customers. And this has often resulted in management in many organizations coming to the point where they're kicking out a sourcing-style chief procurement officer or procurement director, and too often placing procurement under an operational executive. I've seen this in a number of organizations recently where I've interacted with their personnel, and sometimes those interactions have been interesting as people have gone through a painful time period either under a big supply chain management consulting project, which has done scorched earth type of sourcing that's resulted in hurt supplier relationships, and then the consultants gallop off into the sunset and they leave behind poor supplier relationships and hastily created contracts, or it's just an internal hiring decision to bring in somebody who has a history of doing fast cost reductions, and they do the same thing that the big consultancies have done. And so the result of this is that the opportunity for procurement leaders is really to do procurement right again, with a balanced approach to sourcing that builds key supplier relationships, builds supply chain performance, and builds the internal customer relationship. And I think what we're really seeing is a big shift away from pure sourcing towards the concept of category management. And category management, I think, is a much more balanced approach, although it also has its deficiencies where some groups have taken it in the wrong direction. So, long-winded response, but those are some things that I see as major themes.
You mentioned about the fact that either procurement is being put under operational leaders more often than not now because of, a desire by business leaders to think a little bit differently about how they use the functional procurement capabilities, and because there's been so many damaged relationships. And, I see a lot of business leaders being brought in to replace CPOs as kind of the next generation CPO. Do you think that those are isolated cases, or that's becoming more of it's more than just a couple of companies are doing it, it's more of a trend?
Well, let me answer that in two different ways. First of all, I think it is becoming thematic in many organizations, and as the word spreads to other organizations, those executives are saying, this strong-armed procurement approach has really hurt a lot of our internal operations and created tensions within our organization. And now I'm talking to other executives at other companies that have made a move to bring procurement back into being a true support organization. Mm-hmm. And so, just in the last month, I've talked to 2 or 3 different groups, 2 specifically that I can think of that are very large, name-recognized insurance companies, insurance providers in North America. And in both of those cases, they, after 2 years of bringing in a CPO with a mindset of strategic sourcing and cost reduction at all costs, they had enough, and they launched those people out the door. They launched the senior team that supported them, and they've brought in more balanced operational leaders. Right. Many times putting it under finance, almost as a penalty for finance sometimes, right. To get this group straightened out so that they can play well with other children. And so I've definitely seen that as a trend, and I think we'll see that more and more also as total cost of ownership becomes more of a theme.
So do you think that total cost of ownership is easier for a business leader who comes into procurement to kind of use that as his measure of value, or even different value levers rather than cost savings, than it is for CPO, who is just assumed that his value measurement is going to be cost savings?
Yeah, I do. And one of the pain points sort of caused me to bang my head against a brick wall. One of the pain points is the failure by procurement group or procurement leaders to understand the true total cost of ownership and to incorporate that into their decision-making process, not only for themselves, but also to help their internal customers understand that TCO model. In a lot of the training programs that I present and my colleagues present to leading organizations, a big theme is always to help people to understand what is the TCO model, the cost formula, that's really made up of four elements. The first is the cost of acquisition, which is the processing costs, the administrative costs of going through an acquisition process and the management of that supplier. Second one is the cost, the landed cost of the product or service delivered and installed. The third one is the cost of using that product or service over its intended lifetime. And the fourth element is the cost of disposition at the end of the product life cycle. And if you don't consider all four of those elements as you look at a acquisition decision or a product or service selection or a supplier selection, you're missing the boat.
I think that approach is probably more the folks on the direct side are more comfortable with a TCO approach because some of the cost drivers are more apparent and maybe more they're indexed or there's commodity markets that they can be tied to. But how have you been successful, or how have you seen others be successful in applying that kind of model to services?
It's absolutely essential to provide this, to apply this type of model to the services arena. You know, as you and I have discussed, my last real job, I was in charge of about 3/4 of the strategic sourcing and supplier relationships for Bank of America at the time. You know, we were a service organization. You know, we certainly bought some products, but they were not direct products that were folded into a product that we sold out in the marketplace. You know, and so in the world of services, we can definitely see this applied, and I think it's in that world of services, you know, and some of the what we would call indirect expenditures, that the failure to use TCO modeling by too many procurement groups is what has kept them out of that arena. In fact, we see a big trend right now. You know, we've talked about, you know, one of the headache areas being the scorched earth policy of strategic sourcing and how that's moving more towards a category management approach. But one of the things that we see the business leaders pushing back on is in the world of information technology. And we have group after group that's out there that I've heard from where the procurement group, who previously had responsibility for IT sourcing and IT contracting, you know, the organization is forming their own, what they call a vendor management office, a VMO. And many corporations and many IT professionals are doing this because they want the procurement people out of their world. Yeah. They don't want to do 3 bids in a cloud of dust in everything they do. They want to build upon value-added supplier relationships and build upon the standards that they've got and move, you know, in an agile and a fast manner to capture the technology changes. And the old style of procurement just isn't doing that because the procurement people don't understand the TCO and they're pushing for cost savings, you know, without understanding that value measurement. So I think that's a really important trend that needs to be built upon.
Yeah, because that's something that we should be doing as procurement professionals ourselves, is making sure we're providing that level of vendor management or supplier management. I kind of hate the term vendor because it implies a transaction.
I do too, and I try never to use use that. And you know, the Latin word venditor, you know, just means a seller. And if that's how we treat, you know, our suppliers, that's not valuable. But in the world of IT, they call it a VMO. So I use that expression there. No,
I've had that experience with many of my clients, and I cringe every time I hear it. But you know, that's the language that they're comfortable and familiar with.
That's right.
But no, I think it's contingent upon us to be able to be there to provide the level of supplier management that they need, so they're not having to look at building it themselves, because that's how ultimately we become redundant.
Yeah, absolutely. So anyhow, that failure to look at the TCO model is one of the headaches headache areas that I see.
So, something that I wanted to ask, and I've been asking this more and more often recently because it's something I'm just really interested in, is that in getting different perspectives, is that when there's often a burning platform for procurement to come in, or when there's an initial investment in procurement, it's because there's a need to save money. And so the teams that come in pursue an aggressive strategy at cost reduction at all costs. And then only once they've reduced or saved money or claim to save money, do they then sit down and think, okay, how do we then bring more value in different ways? And at that point, they've already damaged all the relationships. They've lost all their political capital. And, that's when teams get booted out and new teams get brought in, kind of starting from scratch again. I'm interested to see, how you have either advised or experienced procurement leaders be able to pursue that cost reduction strategy, to support a burning platform, but do it in a way that doesn't damage all the relationships, so they're able to then kind of climb up the value continuum as they mature a little bit more or as they achieve those early cost savings.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would certainly say that trend is one that's there. I mean, many times a CPO or a procurement leader is brought in because they've done competitive bidding, they've reduced costs in one organization over a couple of year term, and now they go launching off to another organization who brings them in to do the exact same thing. I would suggest that more of a holistic approach to category management is going to prevent that concept of mm-hmm. just doing strategic sourcing or doing bidding and moving the supplier relationships around. A more holistic approach to category management is going to provide, hopefully, an even greater savings opportunity over a longer period of time, but perhaps doesn't burn all of those bridges that you were referring to.
Right.
There's a lot of value in having good supplier relationships and working collaboratively with key suppliers. I definitely believe in competitive bidding. I believe in the value of, single round RFPs and multi-round RFPs and auctions, for more commoditized different types of expenditures. But I think with too many groups, there's a reliance on that, and they're seeing results because before using an auction tool, for example, their people weren't really negotiating. They weren't bidding things out, and now they're using an auction tool, and they're seeing those initial savings. And auctions can be a very valuable part of our toolkit, but too often we don't get the full value that's there by really looking at collaborative negotiations with key suppliers. Let me give you an example. A couple of years ago, our firm was asked to review a $9 million spend category for a large banking organization. Mm-hmm. And $9 million a year was being spent on this category, buying products through a distributor. And the banking organization had been using their reverse auction tool in their e-procurement toolkit. They had been using that for the last decade. They were one of the early innovators who got onto that toolkit. And they had bid out this $9 million spend category. They had auctioned it 3 times during the last decade. And they had changed suppliers twice during that time period. Okay? So you can sort of get the flavor for what they had done.
Yeah.
Well, we were asked, and it was sort of a challenging situation. The CPO, who had a lot of ego, gave our firm a list of their top 100 items in that spend category and said, okay, what can you do for me that we haven't accomplished mm-hmm. with our auction process? So I happen to know a senior executive at the company that was their current provider.
Yeah.
So I picked up the phone and called them and said, "Hey, tell me a little bit about this particular banking customer, and tell me a little bit about how they are acquiring the product, and what are they doing that works, and what are they doing that could be done better." And he said, they have never asked me that question.
Right.
We've never had that type of interactive dialogue. And he said, here's some things I would suggest. And he shared a number of frustrating things that they were doing in how they ordered the product, how they were grouping, what products they were selecting out of the options, etc. The next day I went back to the CPO with a 17% savings on their, the 80% of their $9 million a year spend. There's so much value in negotiations and in collaborative interactions with suppliers that today's procurement professionals are ignoring. They think that an auction or a competitive bid is always going to get them to the lowest possible price. And in reality, if you look at the cost model for most suppliers, auctioning something is only going to touch the profit margin. It's not going to touch the
cost base.
The cost that the profit margin is added onto. And too many procurement professionals just don't understand that, and it's becoming a growing number of them. I remember one of my clients was one of the procurement leaders for actually I think one of the top 5 consumer goods companies in the world, and their quote to me was that an e-auction damages relationship, negotiations builds negotiations, and he would never put a key supplier relationship through an auction process. That's a pretty strong-arm statement for an extremely large company of that nature.
Yeah, I think the strategic supplier portion is key because it is different horses for different courses. So yes, there may be a time and a place for that, but when you start thinking about that, the spend that's most material, and it can be material because of its financial impact, or it can be because of its strategic impact, you really need to start thinking a little bit differently. And a lot of companies do. It's not that we don't at scale, but it's making sure that we're treating those relationships a lot differently than perhaps the ones where we're buying something that is very commoditized, that is low cost, and that has a lot of substitutes.
That's right. And just one more quote on this, and we'll quit beating up on auctions, because I do believe there's a lot of value in auctions. In our firm, we do training on how to conduct successful auctions and things to watch for in doing the process. So I definitely believe it's a great tool. But I remember talking to a senior vice president of national accounts for one of the largest office supply providers in North America, and this was a couple of years ago, and they shared a very interesting thing, because I was just asking them, and we were having just a pleasant conversation, and I asked him a little bit about his perspective on auctions in those customer relationships, and he said, Mark, he said, it's very interesting. He said, for our firm, and again, this is one of the majors that's still standing today, in our firm, our 20 lowest margin customer accounts, none of them were awarded through an auction process.
Interesting.
He said all of them came from either an RFP plus a collaborative negotiation, or were renegotiations with an existing customer where they were seeking additional value, and we could work collaboratively together to take cost out of the equation. So for an organization, I mean, everybody would say that office supplies is a true commodity.
Right.
But for someone to say something like that, that's a very interesting comment, that none of their 20 lowest margin accounts for this major firm, were awarded through an auction process. That's pretty astounding fact to deal with.
When that's one of the key value propositions of using an auction. There is also the speed and the efficiency, but it's supposed to bring you down to the lowest cost quickly.
That's right. Right. It basically trims down the profit margin, but it doesn't really deal with the cost factor that the profit margin is added onto.
I want to move on to what we set out to talk about today, and that's something that we chatted about in the past, and it was a notion that was just really interesting to me, and that's of the concept of a procurement superhero. First, though, is there such a thing as a superhero?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and my answer to that is yes, I believe there are. Mm-hmm. And for anyone who has been the leader of a procurement organization, a director, a CPO, a VP of supply chain, those types of positions, think back over your history, and I can think back over mine. You probably can too, Phil. The procurement superheroes, these are the persons that a procurement leader can turn to for key projects time and time again. And I can think of persons who have worked for me in the past where these are the ones that I know will provide value no matter how difficult the situation. These are people who will pull a rabbit out of the hat every single time. And, I can think of a number of people, probably a handful of people over my career, the people who worked for me in the past, and I can think of a number of them where, if my family had to go out and buy a new car, I would hand any one of these people an envelope full of cash and be 100% confident that they would get me the best deal on the car, and that cash investment would be safe with them. Those are people who are procurement superheroes, and it's not everyone. It's probably in any typical organization, any typical procurement group, it's probably maybe 10% of a typical group, but with training and development, I believe that it can be taken up into the 25 to 30% range. So it really depends on not only who the people are, but what has been invested into them.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when I think, and I've done a lot of work recently on the notion of us transcending kind of the traditional procurement framework or value proposition, and thinking of how do we go from a function that at scale optimizes a business needs to kind of jumping to being an integrator of disruptions and supply ecosystems and things like that. And I look back and think that as a function, our ability to do that is so dependent on individuals. We just haven't been able to figure out what the magic or what the secret sauce is to be able to do that at scale. It's just so individual, and it's based on individual capability, but also individual drive and motivation. And I think that's one of the things when we tie back to, what our future looks like, that is an inhibitor, because if we can only rely on individuals, then we can never actually kind of build our value prop around being able to do some of those other things that we want to be able to do.
That's right. But with that said, I think there are things that a good procurement organization can do to create an environment that not only builds procurement superheroes, but encourages them to act all employees to act at a superhero level, and that can go into career path planning, that can go into motivations, that can go into job rotations and assignments, special project assignments, can go into training and development, skills testing. All of those different animals can be blended together into a holistic environment that is going to encourage people to operate at a higher level of performance. And enjoy doing it and have fun doing it.
Yeah. Are there any of those that are more effective than others, or are there ones that is there kind of a maturity journey where you say you should do one thing first, then follow up with another, and be a stepped approach, or is it just very individual based on the organization and the people they have in their teams?
Well, you sort of have to look at where they are to start with, and that's where one of the best practices is doing a skills diagnostic. There are 3 different approaches to diagnostics, and I won't diverge too far from our topic, but 3 different styles of skills diagnostics. The first one is a self-diagnostic or a self-assessment survey, and this is the most common one. This is the one that's used by a lot of the large supply chain management consultancies, which is, Phil, on a 1 to 10 scale, rate how strong of a negotiator you are.
Yeah.
And that's literally the extent of the question. Well, that's very subjective, and knowing you're a very humble guy. You'd probably say, well, I'm only an 8 on a 10-point scale.
Right.
But are you an 8, or are you lower, or are you higher? And so those self-assessment surveys, and these are done by a lot of the training groups as well. A lot of times just to sell their own services. That style is extremely subjective. The second type of diagnostic is called a behavioral diagnostic, and for example, a question out of one of the diagnostic tools that's out on the internet that's used a lot with different groups, actually will ask you, Phil, in the last year, how many times have you conducted a reverse auction with a value of more than $1 million? Mm-hmm. And you're given a range of numbers, and then the second one is, you rate how many times you've done that. Well, that gauges how much you've done something, what your behavior has been, but that doesn't tell whether or not that actually fits your career path. Because what if you've just been in the category of strategic sourcing, but you've just been put over all inventory management for a large supply chain organization, very important progression.
Yeah.
You could ask that question. Well, guess what? As a director of inventory management, you don't have responsibility for doing reverse auctions any longer. So the nature of the question is going to skew that, and the result of that particular type of question in that diagnostic tool would tell you that you need to be trained on how to do reverse auctions. Well, you might already be an expert on doing reverse auctions from your previous job, and it doesn't diagnose that. So the approach that our firm, and some other firms have taken is much more scientific. We actually do knowledge-based testing on whether or not people understand best practices related to particular competencies. Mm-hmm. In our case, it's 24 different competencies. And by doing that, by answering those questions, half of them are questions that somebody who is proficient in that competency should be able to answer correctly. A third of them are ones where somebody who is advanced in that competency can answer the questions correctly. And the final one or two questions are ones where are sort of zingers, where only a true expert is going to be able to answer them. Yeah. We can take anyone in any position and test their understanding of that competency area, at least from a knowledge-based basis. And that can help then design a good training and developmental plan. So I would say that that's the first step for a lot of organizations, no matter where they are, is they need to do some type of diagnostic to understand the knowledge base of the people in the role. Then they can do more subjective observations on their efficiency in their roles, and then build a career path training plan, build the training and professional development steps that they're going to go through, look at certifications, look at additional university degrees, but also look at job rotations and practical in-the-seat training. So, long-winded response, but those are some of the things I'd observe.
No, I think that's important. And as you were talking there, it was making me wonder, what kind of characteristics do those who, we would term as a superhero, where do they exceed? And then perhaps, and this makes it, I guess, a couple of part question, how is that changing?
Yeah. Well, let me go through maybe just a few observations that I think are attributes of people who we might call a procurement superhero. First of all, they're a professional who has a firm understanding of leading techniques in the sourcing and supplier management toolkit that will consistently deliver results. So they have to understand the best practices in the field of procurement. Secondly, they are less concerned about doing everything perfectly than they are with adding value to everything they touch. Mm-hmm. The people in my history and for my firm's colleagues, the people that I work with, that we require as an attribute, is that the people who work with us, they have to be people that everything they touch in what they're doing in the consulting realm or in the procurement realm, they're adding value to. Okay? Not just trying to score the big win on one particular aspect or on cost reductions, but they need to add value in everything. Another attribute is they are people who build up others around them and lead teams through influence rather than command. Mm-hmm. And some of those people that we talked about at the beginning of the interview that have been known more for a scorched earth type of sourcing policy, they run over people. They ruin people's careers. Right. Some of the big consultancies, they will target people who are trying to focus on value rather than focus on their objective of cost reductions, and they'll ruin their careers, unfortunately. And you've probably seen this in your history as well. That's not what I would call a procurement superhero. Now, others might disagree with me. They say, no, they need to be people who get results at all costs. But I truly believe that what goes around comes around, and a true procurement leader needs to add value. Another attribute is that while some people have grown up, like myself, my first job out of college was as a buyer for a manufacturing company.
Me too.
Which probably is a sad commentary on our professional progression. But we've come up through procurement roles all the way through.
Yeah.
Well, some procurement superheroes have progressed through that, but an increasing number now are being people who are being recruited out of the line of business organizations that they support due to their superior understanding of the business drivers in those spend segments. And I'm seeing a better balance there by incorporating some of those people into that. I remember, and this goes back 20-plus years at Bank of America, when our group, we had made good progress on getting involved in many different spend segments, and we were just beginning to take on the final segment, which was in the human resources area and negotiating HR benefits. And that was a tough category because the HR people didn't want procurement in there at all.
Right.
And even though we had some very good people and sourcing professionals in my team, we weren't making very good headway. So we went out and we hired a lady, still remember her name, Julie Raff, great lady, and we hired her away from a health insurance company, and she was a skilled benefits negotiator for the health insurance company on the sales side.
Mm-hmm.
And we hired her and brought her into our team because she walked the walk and she talked the talk. She didn't know sourcing at all, but we brought her in to be the representative for our team to the HR group, and it turned out to be a huge win. And sometimes we have to do that, and that's worth doing.
Yeah, and you can help them figure out the sourcing and the technical side of things, as long as they have that, they're able to build that relationship with their key stakeholders.
That's right. Two more things that I'd put down as attributes of a procurement superhero. And one goes sort of back to what we were talking about before. And these are people that need to understand that the role of procurement is not just to book cost savings.
Mm-hmm.
That's not what procurement professionals are there to do. There's an old model called the rights of procurement that you may have heard, and that is getting the right product or service at the right cost, in the right quality, delivered to the right place at the right time. And if we don't do all of these things, we're missing a significant portion of the boat. So I think that there has to be a balance there, and it goes back to that TCO modeling and that performance and value management. And the final one is an interesting one that one of my bosses in the past challenged me with. And at the time, again, for Bank of America, and then previously for another bank that was the fifth largest bank holding company in the U.S., I was given the responsibility of company-wide contract management. Now, this was in addition to the procurement and the sourcing work, but a lot of our company's work focuses on contracting management performance. But I was given that responsibility, and I was asked to report to a new boss who led the supply chain operations for B of A, and it was time to develop my performance objectives for my first year of working under this gentleman. And we talked through some of the different goals and objectives and the performance elements that I was going to be graded on. And one that he put in as number one on my list was that I had to demonstrate a willingness to take intelligent risks.
Yeah.
And I looked at him, I said, wait a second, do you realize that you're asking me to be in charge of all contracts management in 110 countries, and you want me to take intelligent risks? I would think that this would say to be a goal of mitigating risk and reducing risk consequences. And he said, yep. And he said, Mark, if your group clamps down on the contracting process and makes it harder for the bank's businesses to get contracts put in place, you're going to shut down the operation, or you could shut down the operation. He said, I don't believe that's the way you look at things, but he said, I want you to demonstrate to me at least 3 times a quarter during the next year where your team has taken an intelligent risk. That's a risk that you have a backup plan developed for, but you've stepped out on faith that something is going to work well, and you've put the proper constraints around it, but you take intelligent risks.
Right.
And that was an eye-opening experience for me. And it's something, though, that as I work with different organizations, I've tried to impart to them that they need to take intelligent risks. They need to step outside the box. So I'd put that on the list of things that a procurement superhero should be willing to do.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, because it goes away from the thinking that everything we do is rigid, which is something that I encourage people to think about. Is that, and I was having a conversation. It wasn't for the podcast, but just with somebody before, with a prospect before we got on the phone here, and talking about the thought of frameworks rather than processes. That we want to be able to kind of lead people in the right direction, but we don't necessarily want to overly make it too burdensome for them, because then that will also change their perception of working with us, and it again drives us down to be nothing more than transactional, and seen as somebody not as a partner of the business. So are the characteristics changing then, as the value proposition of procurement is evolving? And you talked right at the start of the interview about moving towards the notion again of full value procurement. Does that change the superhero characteristics?
I believe it does. I believe it's less acceptance of the sourcing mindset, where procurement people are being turned loose on their internal customers, and it's more of a proposition, and something that our organization has been really successful in doing with a lot of our corporate clients. From a very large, from the Fortune 1 company to all the way down. We've had some very good success in helping them to the procurement leaders to have a different mindset on providing value to the organization. And I can remember one group was talking about the dashboard that they were putting together to track the benefits that were being achieved through the strategic sourcing process, and how they were going to advertise that. And the procurement leader, the most senior person, was saying, "Oh yeah, well, I want to show who were the procurement people who were involved in this, and what were the successes that they achieved, and calculate their total benefits and do things like that." And I thought about it, and I stopped him and I said, I would like you to think of a different approach. I think that your role in sourcing and in procurement and in value management needs to be to make your internal customers into heroes in the eyes of senior management.
Right.
I would suggest that the reports that you're going to put out on a quarterly basis for the C-suite, that those reports go organization by organization. Here's manufacturing and operations. Here are 7 different sourcing projects that were completed, and here's the value proposition that this is going to bring to the organization. Give the credit to those organizations. Senior management's going to know that they were projects that procurement was involved in because you're putting out the report. But give the executive vice president of marketing the credit for the marketing savings. Give the executive in charge of human resources the credit for the value propositions that came out of their organization, and make them into heroes in the eyes of senior management, and see what happens. And guess what? Heard back later, it was a huge win. And after the first report came out, all of a sudden the groups, and even the groups that weren't being given credit for anything because they had been pushed back, all of a sudden they saw the credit that their peers were getting, and they wanted in. They were contacting the head of procurement and asking how they could be part of some future projects. I think that's really an important attribute of what we need to be doing.
Yeah, and I've had experience where that happens, and because I feel like we often clamor to get some recognition for what we do, but taking that approach, when there's board level conversations and C-suite level conversations around how they achieved what they achieved, then those people are going to go to bat for procurement and say it was because it was enabled by procurement, or procurement did this job. So those conversations are going to happen. They're just not going to be on a piece of paper. And so long as you have folks like that at that level who are standing up for the value that you can bring, then that to me, that's one of the key ways that we get away from just being measured on cost all the time, because you're not going to get fired, or I think in very few cases you'll get fired as a procurement leader for maybe missing your savings target by a little bit if you have all these people who are standing up for you around the business saying what a great job you are in enabling them to be successful.
That's right. And I think there's a huge disconnect when a procurement group, led by a sourcing mindset type of an executive, is putting out report after report of, here are the savings, Mr. CEO or Ms. CEO, that we got for you. Here are the savings that procurement got for you. This was a savings we got in marketing. Well, that's now implying that marketing, that procurement needed to be sticked onto the marketing organization in order to get the savings, and that they weren't a player in that. That's the wrong messaging to be putting out. And that's also sometimes the messaging that the big consultants do, and I won't mention any names, but the top 5 sourcing consultancies, and sometimes they do things well and they do it in a more value-added way, but sometimes they claim, they ring up the savings and they go galloping off into the sunset, with them being the ones who got the savings, and left behind are these organizations whose supplier relationships in some cases have been damaged or changed, and now those groups are trying to manage supplier relationships that aren't highly motivational for the suppliers. That's a bad thing to have happen.
Yeah, while the consultant then goes and claims a 20-to-1 ROI on their fees as justification, and then to sell the model to the next client.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, in the world of consulting, where I and my colleagues are, it's very interesting that we're often called in to rebuild and transform procurement groups that have basically been shredded apart and decimated by the consultants who went through the first time. So there's a whole industry level out there, and you're aware of that, Phil, that there's a whole industry out there that follows the big consultancies and repairs things and helps procurement groups actually provide a holistic practice. Very sad.
It goes back into what we talked about before about saving money at all costs, cost reduction at all costs, but then all the collateral damage that then does. That in the moment, the people who are doing it don't really care because that's how they're incented. Talking about incentivization, we talked about superheroes and some of the characteristics, and some of those characteristics are not necessarily aligned with the way that we're measured, which is unfortunately still typically cost savings. So do you measure, or do you encourage CPOs to measure the performance of their superheroes in different ways than they may the rest of the organization?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm a big believer in the 360-degree input model, where it comes to not only feedback on the performance of procurement professionals, but also in terms of their progression within the organization, their career advancement. And I think that there are quotes by people like Tom Peters that go back many years that any organization that refuses to get rid of non-performing employees, and this is a very rough paraphrase, any organization that refuses to get rid of non-performing employees is not going to progress. And there's a lot of truth to that. I think a true procurement leader has to be able to look at their staff, and if you're going to incent performance, I think that raises and promotional opportunities need to be provided to the top third of the employees in that organization. I would say that the employees who are performing at an average level, they should only have cost of living increases and not have merit increases. Reserve those and encourage those people who are the true superheroes to perform at a higher level. And the folks who are at the bottom third or the bottom quarter, measure them up or measure them out. Get rid of the non-performing people, and by bringing in new blood and new talent, and obviously that's harder to do in certain industries and sectors than it is in others. But don't overly incent people to do a mediocre job. there needs to be a willingness to step up to the plate, and getting input from your key internal customers on the value proposition of the procurement people who are working in your team. That's one aspect of doing that. But also, think way outside the box. Maybe get input from the suppliers that are working with particular people,
right.
Some of your key people, and find out what's the value proposition or what's being missed by those people, because they're focused so much on cost savings that they're missing value benefits.
Right. And I think particularly the case when you have small or relatively flat structures where there isn't promotional opportunities that you can give to superheroes, because that's one of the challenges, and that's one that I've struggled with in the past, where I've been fortunate to be successful in companies that have been relatively flat, is where do you go, how do you develop yourself from there? And there are often very few opportunities, very few chances, but at least financial benefits incent you to carry on doing the things that you're doing.
Right. And also realize that if your organization doesn't have the promotional opportunities that other ones will, you're probably going to lose some of those procurement superheroes. So that's where you need to be filling the bottom end of the organization with talented people who can also progress, and realize that you're probably going to lose some of those high-end people. They're going to progress into other opportunities. The goal is to retain them as long as possible. And organizations are they're looking at a lot of different things in their staffing models, especially with some of the skilled practitioners in the baby boom generation leaving the workforce. You can do a lot with having, if you're a small organization or an organization with a relatively flat structure, consider bringing back in some people who are retirees, for part-time work. That's a big model. Consider augmenting your workforce with some talented interns who are in graduate programs. Consider using one or two skilled consultancies to do strategic work for you at a cost-effective level, but do it on a retainer basis rather than waiting for an emergency and then trying to go out to the marketplace and finding someone to support you. Have those people, keep feeding them some work, during the lean times. Keep that relationship intact by feeding them some work, on as needed basis, and make sure you have some flexibility in your budget in order to do that. So you can do a whole lot, and we work with lots of organizations on how to build what's called a dynamic staffing model to create what is the opportunity and the best model for acquiring talent and retaining talent.
So, Mark, we're coming up against time here. We've talked for a good amount of time here, I think 55 minutes plus. So I just had one final question to wrap up with before we kind of go our separate ways. And that's, what's your top resolution? And I asked this, we're recording it very early in January, hence why this question came to mind. What's the top resolution for procurement profession and for procurement professionals in 2017?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would probably say that one element is for procurement leaders and procurement superheroes to really focus on relationships, the value of relationships. Those are relationships with their internal customers. Those are relationships with external suppliers. And to build and mentor the more strategic relationships and spend time on that relationship management. That can come through the value of negotiations. That can come through the value of supplier relationship management and customer relationship management. The second one that I would say, just adding on, is that procurement leaders today, I believe they need to keep their eyes wide open for changes that may take place in 2017. I believe that there could be changes economically from a macroeconomic level in the nature of supplier relationships around the globe. I think there are changes that we may be seeing in maturing marketplaces and dynamic changes in those marketplaces. But I also think that some things could change rather quickly, depending on what the USA specifically, and also in Europe, what changes take place in incoming imports coming out of different regions of the world, and shifts in the low-cost country value proposition, but then also changes in the countries themselves where we're buying a lot of products. So keep your eyes open and look at those things.
Okay. Well, Mark, I just really appreciate the time that you've spent with me today. There's so much information in there to really to reflect on and to think about, how we can really continue to change and evolve our value proposition, the different things that we can think about. And also, for procurement professionals that are listening who haven't yet got into that top tier, what are the things you need to be working on? So I just wanted to ask before we go, is there any way, or you got any preferred way that listeners can either reach out to you, find you on the internet, get in touch if they would like to? Where would you point them?
Sure. And Phil, thank you very much for spending time with me and chatting with me. As I think most of your followers know, they can probably learn as much directly from you on a lot of these topics you interview people on.
Thank you.
And, your knowledge and understanding of the procurement space is very impressive. So they're going to a good place for information. With regards to myself and our firm, people can reach out to me on LinkedIn to be connected to my profile. They can also go to strategicprocurementsolutions.com.
Yeah.
And our organization, we put out a free newsletter to anyone who wants to receive that goes out every other month. And so I think we're up to edition number 77 or so, and people are welcome to view those past editions on the website, or contact us through the contact page of the website as well, and I'm always happy to interact with people. So thank you very much for this time.
No, thank you, Mac. And what I'll do is I will include links to your LinkedIn profile, to the website, to the sign-up form for the newsletter as well. Those will all be on the show notes page for today's interview. That's going to be at artofprocurement.com/SPS. That's artofprocurement.com/SPS. So, Mark, just one more time, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.